a lot of it is just reflecting back on the things that I say and how I interact with my students. So that was a huge thing for me was, okay, what types of things am I doing with my students? How am I, especially facially, reacting to my students? The videotaping was a great thing for me because I looked back and I was like, oh, I didn't realize that I say those kind of things, or oh, I didn't realize that like when a student's struggling, a lot of times I try to like help them out. And sometimes it's even by just like giving them a smile. And it's those little things that then you see how they react and they're maybe a little down about themselves and all of a sudden they brighten up and they're more confident in themselves.
I think just being able to reflect on everything and the edTPA separates it into the planning and the presentation and the assessment, and reflecting at each point and making sure that what I'm presenting is what I planned, what I'm assessing is what I planned, and it's what I presented, and be to reflect on it all and tie it all together. I think that really improves what I've been doing.
I think the planning aspect of it, because when I first started in my student teaching placement, it was a lot of like, I'm just gonna look at it the night before and then just kind of wing it, and that doesn't really work when you're trying to plan a really great lesson. When you do the planning, everything just falls into place. Like it goes so much smoother and it's so much easier on you as a teacher. So I think the planning aspect of it was really beneficial going into my first year of teaching.
I'd say yes, because in the traditional Gate 2 that my classmates did, they only had to look at 4 standards in the Wisconsin teaching standards, and chances are you've already addressed them in your Gate 1. And I think for me, my lessons incorporated all 10 of the standards. It shows that I know how to teach. It shows that I know my content. It shows that I can adapt and make changes based on my students. And I think for me, it's about all good lessons and all good units should incorporate all 10 of those things. It should connect to the community. And I think if we're just looking at several or 1 or 2 and applying them to a lesson, that is not fully engaging every single student in that lesson.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more applicable because you're going to be always planning instruction, and there's so many of the standards that fit into that planning aspect of it. When you're planning, you have to know the needs of your class, you have to know what kinds of learners there are, you need to know how to differentiate your instruction. And a lot of times with the planning, if you're involving the community, you have to do all that ahead of time. You can't just show up at the police station and expect for them to know what's going on. So there's so much just in the planning portion of the edTPA that you need to know ahead of time that fit right into those standards. And then same with instruction. You need to engage your learners and you need to be doing the things that are supporting their needs and their learning in that. And then with assessment, that's a lot about being reflective and did my students learn what I was trying to teach them. So I think there's so many of those Wisconsin standards built right into the format of edTPA.
Perfect.
So when I did the edTPA, I didn't really think of the standards as I was doing it, but then I went back and reflected on it, and you really use all of the standards in your lessons, but you do it more naturally. You're not planning to make sure that you hit these standards. You look back and you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I did assess this. I did do the planning standards. I did involve the community with it. And I feel like it's more of a natural flow than if you're gonna be really choppy if you really want to hit this one, okay, and I'm gonna hit this one, I'm gonna hit this one. It just flows so much better when you do it with the edTPA.
Awesome.
One of the biggest things that I saw with edTPA is that you were a lot more reflective with edTPA. You're reflecting back on not only how you teach, but you're reflecting back on first, okay, so I created my lesson plan. These are all my materials. Why did you do those things, and what theories and who supports these things that you're doing? Which isn't something you would necessarily do that with the Wisconsin teaching standards. It's something that's encouraged, but it's something you don't always think of as a student. There were times that it did feel a little bit like busy work, but part of that was just because we needed a little more time, and I didn't at least realize how much time it was going to take me to get all of this done. So some of it felt like busy work because a lot of it is kind of saying the same thing. So when you're reflecting back on it and when you're saying, oh, well, these theories are what went into my teaching, you're like, well, these are kind of the same theories, but they're looking at it from a slightly different view.
I was already confident confident in my ability to write lesson plans and create units. But I guess you really discover I can take in this research. You know, people talk about the research and all the different theories, and that was one of my biggest challenges when I thought about edTPA. What theories do I know that I can bring in? I was reading them, it's like, oh, you know, this fits what I'm doing without even noticing it. And then when I look further into the research, I can further change my lesson plans and make it so much stronger and be like, why did I choose this activity? Because this research backs it up. And I didn't think that I was, you know, capable of doing that really, because it's not something you do when you do lessons in, you know, your classroom. You talk about it, but not in that depth.
A lot of what I discovered was from the videotaping. You know, so you see all the little nuances that distract the students. You know, I would, you know, scratch my arm a lot, or, you know, face or whatever. And you don't really notice you're doing those sort of things until you videotape yourself. Then you see how the kids are reacting to everything too, because you can't see it all, especially being a new teacher. You're not used to watching everybody yet. So you can see which kids are engaged and which kids are not engaged. And that will help you to build better lessons to make sure you can get the attention of all the students.
I think for me, it's that I can always grow as a teacher. I've been teaching for a long time in terms of, like, I teach lifeguarding, I've taught swim lessons, I've worked with 4-H, but in terms of, there's still a huge growing process between your student teaching your first year and your 10th year, and I think for me that's like what teaching is all about. And I think it not only can we like look at the process, and I know, you know, in time's sake we don't necessarily have time to do this entire edTPA process, but I think it identified growth areas for me, and I can work on a growth area every so often to be like, yep, this is where I want to grow and this is where I need to grow to benefit my students.
Start early.
Start as early as possible.
Start early.
One of the biggest things that I would have to tell other people is make sure that you put your time in early. Make sure that you're setting aside the time.
I would say to pace yourself. You get the documents with, you know, anywhere from 5 to 10 questions that you have to answer, and it looks very overwhelming, but just take 1 or 2 questions at a time, go take a coffee break, answer a couple more questions, you know, pace it out throughout the week. You know, what I did is I said, okay, this week I want to have the planning commentary done, and I said, Tuesday I'm going to do 2 questions, Wednesday I'm busy, I'm going to do 1 question, Thursday I'm going to do 2 more questions, and that way it's not as overwhelming to get everything done.
I think it helped me talk about some of the things that are going on in the schools today. It's all about proving that your students learned and educator effectiveness and knowing that you did your job and you did it well. And I think that TPA was a perfect example of that, because it did allow me to show that like my students learned something. I look at their pre-test and their post-test, and my students, you know, as much as they thought the post-test was difficult, that they learned something, and they learned something about the world and how we as Americans interact with the Middle East.
Right. Awesome.